Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer pressed his eye against the rubber cup of the 2-centimeter Flak 38 gun, sight scanning the pre-dawn sky over Normandy. The 22-year-old gunner had been at his post since midnight, and his legs ached from standing. Around him, the rest of his 8-man crew huddled against the June chill, their breath visible in the darkness. "Anything?" his loader asked. Klaus shook his head. The skies over France had been quiet all night. Too quiet. 3 miles inland from what the Allies would soon call Omaha Beach, Klaus' gun was one of 30 Flak 38s assigned to Flak Sturm Regiment 1. The regiment was fully mechanized and heavily armed. 18 4-barrel Flak-Vierling 38 guns and 12 massive 8.8-centimeter weapons. On paper, they were ready for anything. On paper. Klaus had been a flak gunner for 18 months. Head trained in Germany, deployed to France in March, and spent the last 3 months preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. His instructors had been confident, almost cocky. The American fighter bombers are vulnerable, they'd said. They must come low to bomb. When they do, you will shoot them down. It will be easy. Easy. Klaus would remember that word for the rest of his life. At 05:30 hours, the first sound reached his ears. Not the roar of engines. That would come later. But a distant rumble like thunder rolling across the sea. He turned toward the coast and his stomach dropped. The horizon was alive with fire. Naval gunfire. Hundreds of ships were unleashing hell on the Atlantic wall. The invasion had begun. "Stand to," his section commander shouted. Aircraft incoming from the north. Klaus swung his gun sight toward the channel. At first he saw nothing but gray clouds. Then the clouds themselves seemed to darken, to thicken, to grow solid. They weren't clouds. The sky filled with aircraft. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. B-17 flying fortresses at high altitude, their contrails painting white lines across the dawn. B-26 Marauders at medium altitude in tight formations, and lower, much lower, single-engine fighters dropping toward the French countryside like hunting hawks. P-47 Thunderbolts. Klaus had seen photographs during training. He knew the silhouette, the massive radial engine, the thick fuselage, the distinctive shape that American pilots called the jug. But photographs hadn't prepared him for this. They were everywhere. "Target," his commander screamed. "Engage." Klaus' left hand worked the traverse, his right, the elevation, his foot hovering over the trigger. A Thunderbolt flashed past at 300 feet, moving at over 300 miles per hour. Klaus fired. The 2-centimeter cannon hammered spitting shells at 800 rounds per minute. He missed completely. The Thunderbolt didn't even deviate from its course. It simply kept going low and fast, headed inland toward the German positions behind the beach. Klaus worked the gun, desperately tracking another P-47. Fire. Miss. Another one. Fire. Miss. They were too fast, too low, and there were too many of them. By 0800 hours, 13 Thunderbolt groups from the 8th and 9th Air Forces had put 148 sorties into the air. They came in waves, cutting railway lines, hitting troop concentrations, bombing anything that moved toward the beach. Klaus' gun crew fired until their ammunition boxes were empty, reloaded, and fired again. Klaus hit exactly 1 Thunderbolt that morning. He watched his tracer rounds sparkle against the aircraft's left wing. The P-47 shuddered, dipped slightly, then kept flying. The pilot pulled up, banked hard right, and disappeared over the tree line. The gun hadn't stopped it. It had barely inconvenienced it. By nightfall on June 6, the Luftwaffe flak crews defending Normandy had shot down exactly 3 P-47s. 3 out of more than 2,000 sorties flown. The Americans lost 3 more Thunderbolts to their own bomb blasts, and 3 to unknown causes. Total losses 9 aircraft. Klaus sat beside his gun that night, eating cold rations, and listened to the distant rumble of naval gunfire. The invasion had succeeded. The Allies were ashore. And tomorrow, the P-47s would be back. His commander had been right about one thing: the American fighter bombers did have to come low to bomb. But nothing else about this was going to be easy. 6 months earlier. Boley Airfield, England. April 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Van Slayden stood beside his new aircraft and tried to make peace with what he was seeing. At 29 years old, he was one of the youngest lieutenant colonels in the Army Air Corps, and had just been assigned to the 48th Fighter Group to transition pilots to a new weapon, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter any of them had ever seen. Good God, one of his pilots muttered. That thing's enormous. He wasn't wrong. The P-47 was twice the weight of most contemporary fighters. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, bombs, and rockets, it weighed 8 tons. 8 tons trying to fly on one engine. But what an engine! The Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower. 300 with water injection. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder the size of a man's fist. The massive engine gave the Thunderbolt its distinctive blunt-nosed appearance. Some pilots called it the Warthog. Others called it the Jug, either for its milk jug shape or because it was a juggernaut that packed a devastating punch. Van Slayden climbed up on the wing and looked into the cockpit. Armor plates surrounded the pilot's seat. Thick, heavy armor, designed to stop machine gun fire and shell fragments. More armor protected the engine. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to dance with enemy fighters at high altitude. It was designed to survive. Gentleman, Van Slayden addressed his assembled pilots. This is not the plane you trained on. It doesn't turn like a Mustang. It doesn't climb like a Spitfire. But it does 3 things better than any fighter in the world. He ticked them off on his fingers. First, it dives faster than anything the Germans have. Once you're at altitude, you can dive away from any Luftwaffe fighter that tries to engage you. Second, it's the most rugged aircraft ever built. You can bring it home with damage that would destroy any other fighter. He paused. And third, it's armed with 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. 4 in each wing. That's more firepower than a bomber. When you open up on a ground target, you're putting 8 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into it at 3,000 rounds per minute combined. A pilot raised his hand. What about air-to-air combat, sir? If a German fighter jumps, you drop your ordnance and fight. The P-47 is deadly in a dive attack. Bounce and zoom. But our primary mission isn't dogfighting. We're fighter bombers now. Our job is to support the invasion when it comes. Another hand. What kind of ordnance, sir? Van Slayden grinned. Each aircraft carries 2 500-pound bombs and 5-inch rockets. Sometimes we'll carry 1,000-pound bombs instead. And when we're done bombing, we strafe with those 850s. The pilots exchanged looks. This was different from everything they'd trained for. This was ground attack, flying low and slow, exposing themselves to anti-aircraft fire, hunting targets on the deck instead of enemy fighters in the clouds. I won't lie to you, Van Slayden continued. This mission is dangerous. The Germans have flak guns everywhere. We'll be flying into concentrated anti-aircraft fire on every mission. Some of you won't come back. The assembled pilots grew quiet. But this aircraft was built for this mission. The armor will protect you. The engine will take hits and keep running. The airframe can absorb damage that would tear apart any other fighter. The Germans think we'll be easy targets when we come low. They're wrong. Over the next 4 weeks, the 48th Fighter Group trained relentlessly. Dive bombing, glide bombing, low-level navigation, rocket attacks. They flew until the techniques were burned into muscle memory. On April 20, 1944, They flew their first combat mission over occupied France. Van Slayden led the formation across the channel low over the water to avoid radar detection, then pulled up to attack altitude over the French coast. Below him, German-held territory stretched to the horizon. Roads, railways, bridges, motor transport, troop concentrations. All targets. The briefing officer had told them the Germans were using extra tracer ammunition to make new pilots nervous. Van Slayden quickly confirmed this was working. The sky filled with red and orange streaks, 2 centimeter and 3.7 centimeter rounds arcing up toward them. But they pressed the attack. Van Slayden lined up a railway yard, pushed into his dive, and released his bombs at 4,000 feet. The Thunderbolt surged upward as 2,000 pounds of high explosive dropped away. He pulled hard right, climbing and turning in 3 dimensions, making himself the hardest possible target for the flak gunners below. Behind him, the railway yard erupted in orange flame. His entire squadron made it home that day. Every aircraft returned, though several bore fresh holes in their wings and fuselages. The ground crews counted the damage, 20mm hits that had punched through aluminum skin but missed anything vital. The P-47 had passed its first test. By June, Van Slayden and his pilots were veterans. They'd flown dozens of missions over France, perfecting their techniques, learning which targets were defended and which were vulnerable. They met no Luftwaffe opposition over France. The skies belonged to the Allies now. But the flak was always there, angry red tracers reaching up from every defended position. And then came the morning of June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord. The invasion of France. The 48th Fighter Group launched at dawn as part of the largest aerial armada ever assembled. Their mission: attack German positions near the beaches, cut off reinforcements, and prevent the Wehrmacht from concentrating forces against the landings. Van Slayden led his squadron over Normandy at first light. Below him, the English Channel was packed with ships, an invasion fleet beyond anything had imagined. The beaches themselves were obscured by smoke and fire. All aircraft, this is Starlight Leader Van Slayden radioed. Targets of opportunity. Anything moving toward the beach is hostile. Weapons free. They found a German convoy on a road 3 miles inland. Trucks, half-tracks towed artillery. Van Slayden rolled into his attack, dive rockets rippling from his wings, machine guns hammering. The convoy disintegrated under the onslaught. Vehicles exploded, flipped, burned. Other Thunderbolts followed him down, each adding their firepower to the destruction. Within minutes, the entire convoy was destroyed or abandoned. The flak response was surprisingly light. The Germans were overwhelmed, their flak batteries repositioning frantically to deal with threats from multiple directions. The carefully prepared defenses that were supposed to repel Allied fighter bombers weren't functioning as planned. By the time Van Slayden landed back in England, had flown 3 missions. His P-47 had taken several hits, 2 centimeter rounds through the left wing, a gouge in the engine cowling. But it had brought him home. The invasion was succeeding. The Allies were ashore, and the P-47 Thunderbolts were ruling the skies over Normandy. The second day of the invasion was when the German flak gunners found their footing. Captain Max Strohm led Hoover Blue Flight of the 366th Fighter Group's 390th Fighter Squadron on their 4th mission of June 7th. Each Thunderbolt carried 36 M41 20-pound fragmentation bombs, small weapons designed to explode into thousands of razor-sharp fragments that would shred exposed personnel and light vehicles. They'd been flying since 0600 hours, hitting gun positions, attacking troop concentrations, supporting the embattled soldiers on Omaha Beach. The mission briefing had been clear: gun positions will be given priority, as they have taken a heavy toll on Beach Omaha. At 2100 hours, Strohm spotted 12 German tanks on a road south of Veer moving toward the coast. Panzers, heavy tanks that could devastate Allied infantry if they reached the battlefield. Hoover blew too. This is lead, Strom called. You still have ordnance? Affirmative, lead. Both racks full. Lieutenant Paul Luthi was the junior man in the flight, but he was a good pilot. Steady, reliable, climb to 4,000 and make your run. I'll follow you down. Strom watched Luthi's Thunderbolt climb above him, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The sun was setting. This would be their last attack of the day. Luthi rolled inverted and dove toward the tanks. His P-47 accelerated to over 300 miles per hour, the wind screaming over its wings. At 2,000 feet he released his bombs, and that's when the German Flak found him. The tanks weren't undefended. Traveling with them was a platoon of mobile flak guns, SATFS, 7-1 half-tracks, each mounting a 4-barrel Flakvierling, 38 anti-aircraft gun. They'd been waiting camouflaged, conserving ammunition until the American fighter bombers committed to their attack run. Now they opened fire. 4 guns, 16 barrels. Combined rate of fire over 3,000 rounds per minute. The air around Luthi's P-47 turned into a wall of red tracers and explosive shells. Strom watched horror rising in his throat. Pull out. Pull out. Luthi's bombs released, and at the same instant one exploded directly beneath his aircraft, either hit by a 20mm shell or detonating sympathetically from the vibration. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently. Black smoke poured from the engine. Lead, this is blue too. IM hit. Engines running rough. Luthi pulled out of the dive and began climbing, heading northwest toward friendly lines. His P-47 was trailing black smoke, but the engine was still running. At 4,000 feet he leveled off. That's when the engine quit. The Pratt Whitney R2800 simply stopped. The propeller windmilled for a moment, then froze. IM bailing out, Luthi transmitted. Strom watched his wingman's canopy fly off. Luthi stood up in the cockpit, fought against the wind, and jumped. His parachute blossomed white against the darkening sky. The P-47 continued forward for a moment, then nosed over, and began its final dive into France. It hit the ground 3 miles from the tanks, erupting in a ball of orange flame. Strom circled overhead until he saw Luthi hit the ground safely. Then, he had to turn for home. The sun was setting. His fuel was low, and there was nothing more he could do. Lieutenant Paul Luthi would spend the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. He was the only survivor of 4 pilots from the 366th Fighter Group shot down on June 7th. It was the bloodiest day in the group's history. Across Normandy, the story repeated itself. The German flak gunners had learned from June 6th. They'd repositioned their weapons. They'd refined their tactics. They waited for the Thunderbolts to commit to their attack runs, then opened fire when the pilots couldn't maneuver. Men. June 7 Hine. Tactical Air Command flew nearly 2,800 sorties. The 8th Air Force's P-47 equipped groups flew hundreds more in tactical support. 30 Thunderbolts were destroyed that day. 15 of them fell to flak, light, intense and accurate fire from 20mm and 37mm guns. The German flak crews had drawn first blood, but the battle was far from over. The P-47 pilots learned quickly. Captain Kirby Martin led Red Flight of the 389th Fighter Squadron on an armed reconnaissance mission on April 9, 1944, 2 months before D-Day, but the lessons applied. They attacked the marshalling yards at Argentan in France. Martin made his strafing pass, pulled up to 3,000 feet, and called for his flight to reform. That's when Lieutenant Forbes radioed, voice tight with controlled panic. Red, lead. This is Red, 3. IM hit. Oil pressure 0. Martin looked back. Forbes' Thunderbolt was trailing a thin stream of gray smoke. Not black smoke, which would indicate fire, but gray, which meant oil. Can you make the channel? I'm going to try. They were 50 miles from the English Channel. 50 miles of German-occupied France with a dying engine. The Pratt Whitney R2800 was designed with redundancy in mind. 2 rows of cylinders, multiple oil passages, robust construction. But without oil pressure, even the toughest engine would seize. Forbes nursed his crippled Thunderbolt northwest, maintaining altitude, conserving every revolution of the propeller. The oil temperature gauge climbed steadily. The cylinder head temperature followed. 30 miles from the channel, the engine began knocking. 20 miles out, it was running rough, missing on several cylinders. 10 miles out, it was barely producing power. Forbes crossed the French coast at 2,000 feet. Below him, the channel stretched gray and cold. If the engine quit now, he'd have to ditch in the water. The engine kept running. 5 miles offshore, Forbes radioed red lead: "I'm not going to make England. I'm putting her down in the channel. Negative red 3. You're almost home. Keep her flying." Forbes gritted his teeth and held course. The English coast appeared ahead. White cliffs, green fields, safety. The engine seized completely 1 mile from shore. The propeller stopped. The cockpit filled with smoke. But Forbes had altitude and airspeed. He glided the P-47 toward the nearest airfield, lowered his landing gear, and dead-sticked onto the runway. The Thunderbolt rolled to a stop. Forbes sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, then climbed out. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft. The engine was destroyed. Oil drained away by a single 20mm round that had punctured an oil line. By all rights, the engine should have seized over France, forcing Forbes to bail out into enemy territory. But the R2800's redundant design had kept it running just long enough to get him home. Stories like Forbes spread through the P-47 squadrons like wildfire. The Thunderbolt could take damage and keep flying. It could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters. Pilots who would have been dead or captured in other aircraft were coming home in shot-up P-47s. The aircraft was earning its nickname, the Jug. The Juggernaut. But survival required more than just a rugged aircraft. It required tactics. The Flak gunners had advantages. They knew the terrain. They could camouflage their positions. They could wait patiently for the perfect moment to fire. And once a P-47 committed to an attack dive, the pilot's options were limited. Continue the attack and risk getting hit, or break off and miss the target. The Thunderbolt pilots developed counter-tactics. First, never fly straight and level at low altitude. A predictable flight path was a death sentence. Instead, they flew in a constant corkscrew pattern, climbing 500 feet turning right, descending 500 feet turning left, adding rolls and variations to make themselves impossible to track. Second, attack and dives from altitude. The P-47 could dive faster than any German fighter, over 500 mph in a steep dive. That speed made deflection shots nearly impossible for Flak gunners. The pilots would dive from 8,000 or 9,000 feet, release bombs at 4,000 feet, and then pull hard into a climbing turn that changed direction on 2 axes. Third, speed is life. After weapons release, the pilots pushed their throttles to maximum power and accelerated. The faster they were moving, the harder they were to hit. A Flak gunner trying to track a P-47 diving at 400 mph, then pulling up and turning at 350 mph, had to calculate lead traverse elevation and range simultaneously. It was nearly impossible. Fourth, never return to a target. The German Flak crews were patient. They'd hold fire during the first attack, noting the Thunderbolt's approach pattern. Then when the aircraft returned for a second pass, the guns would be ready, aimed at exactly where the pilots would appear. The mutual support. Flights worked together, with one element attacking while another suppressed Flak positions with strafing fire. The Flak gunners couldn't track multiple targets simultaneously. If they focused on the bombers, the strafers would kill them. If they focused on the strafers, the bombers would hit their target. These tactics were refined through trial and error, written down in after-action reports and disseminated to other squadrons. By the summer of 1944 they were standard doctrine. But the Germans were learning too. Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer watched the American Thunderbolts swarm over Normandy like angry hornets and tried to understand what had gone wrong. It was late June 1944. 3 weeks since the invasion. His Flak Regiment 1 had been fighting, constantly firing until their barrels glowed red, reloading, firing again. They'd shot down dozens of Allied aircraft, but there were always more. The Americans flew multiple missions per day, sometimes 4 or 5 sorties per aircraft. They struck trains, bridges, roads, troop columns, supply depots, headquarters, communication centers. Anything that moved. Anything that stayed still. Klaus' regiment had lost nearly 200 men killed or wounded. 5 of his guns' original crew were casualties, replaced by younger, less experienced gunners who struggled with the complex task of tracking fast-moving aircraft. The 2-centimeter Flak 38 was an adequate weapon. It had good range, decent rate of fire, and when it hit an aircraft, the high explosive shells did significant damage. But it had critical flaws. The biggest flaw was the ammunition feed system. The Flak 38 used 20-round box magazines that had to be manually changed by the loaders. At 800 rounds per minute cyclic rate, a single magazine lasted exactly 90 seconds of sustained fire. Then the gun fell silent while the loaders struggled to attach a new magazine. 90 seconds was an eternity in combat. A Thunderbolt attacking at 300 miles per hour covered 7.5 miles in 90 seconds. By the time Klaus loaders finished changing magazines, the target was gone. The Wehrmacht attempted to address this by fielding the Flak 38, 4 guns mounted together with their magazines centrally positioned. This gave sustained firepower and reduced reload time. But the fundamental problem remained box magazines on automatic cannon with extremely high rates of fire. What the Germans really needed was belt-fed ammunition. They had it in development. The 3-centimeter Flak 38 guns in early 1945, when the war was already lost. Klaus' regiment also received mobile armor, ST-KFZ. 1 half-tracks mounting Flak 38 guns. The mobility helped. The Flak crews could reposition quickly, avoid counter-battery fire, and support advancing or retreating ground forces. But mobility came with its own problems. A half-track mounting a Flak 38 had minimal armor, just 6mm splinter shields. When a P-47 rolled in with 850 caliber machine guns firing, that thin armor was useless. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the steel and turned the crew compartment into a killing zone. Klaus watched a half-track mounted gun take a strafing run in early July. The Thunderbolt came in low and fast, guns sparking. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the half-track's armor like a deadly typewriter. The vehicle erupted in flame. The crew, 8 men, died before they could bail out. Klaus vomited behind his gun emplacement. Had known 3 of those men. The Wehrmacht tried to address the armor problem with Flak panzers, fully tracked and armored vehicles mounting anti-aircraft guns. The Wirbelwind mounted a Flak 38 in an enclosed armored turret on a Panzer IV chassis. It was arguably the most effective armored anti-aircraft vehicle of the war. But only 87 to 105 were built. Not enough to make a difference. By August 1944, 3. Flakkorps, the primary anti-aircraft force in Normandy, was being systematically destroyed. The Corps lost nearly 1,000 guns during its fighting withdrawal from Normandy. 2 of its 3 Flaksturm regiments were almost completely wiped out. 11,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The Thunderbolts had won. August 18, 1944. Falaise Pocket, Normandy. The German 5th Panzer Army and 7th Army were trapped. 4 Allied field armies, the US 1st and 3rd, Canadian 1st and British 2nd, had encircled roughly 100,000 German troops in a rapidly shrinking pocket near Falaise. The Wehrmacht was attempting a fighting withdrawal, trying to break through the encirclement before the noose tightened completely. The roads were packed with retreating German forces, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, horse-drawn artillery, soldiers on foot, all streaming east toward the single remaining escape route. It was a target-rich environment. Lieutenant Colonel Van Slayden led his squadron over the pocket at 8,000 feet and looked down at what could only be described as chaos. The roads were jammed bumper to bumper with vehicles. Smoke rose from dozens of fires. Destroyed equipment littered the fields. Starlight flight, this is lead. Targets of opportunity. Pick your lanes and attack in sequence. Watch for flak. The Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dives. Slayden selected a column of trucks on a road northwest of Argenton. He pushed his nose down building speed and released his bombs at 4,000 feet. 2 500-pound GP bombs tumbled away. He pulled hard right, climbing and turning, watching over his shoulder. The bombs bracketed the road. Trucks exploded, flipped, scattered. Secondary explosions followed, ammunition or fuel cooking off. Slayden's wingman followed him down, adding more bombs to the destruction. Then the second element attacked. Then the third. Within minutes, that stretch of road was impassable. Burning vehicles, craters, debris. And the flak response was minimal. 3. Flakorps was nearly finished. The regiment had been badly depleted in the fighting since D-Day. Many of the mobile guns had been destroyed or abandoned due to fuel shortages. The crews that remained were exhausted, low on ammunition, and demoralized. More Thunderbolt formations followed. The 366th Fighter Group, the 371st, the 404th 4th. They struck the retreating columns from multiple directions, overwhelming the remaining flak defenses. Slayden made 3 more passes over the pocket that day, strafing with his .850 caliber machine guns. The destruction was unlike anything he'd seen. Hundreds of vehicles destroyed, thousands of German soldiers killed or scattered into the countryside. On August 21, the pocket closed. Roughly 60,000 Germans had escaped. About 50,000 were killed or captured. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. My Flakorps was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Thunderbolts continued their rampage across France through August and September, attacking retreating German formations, hitting supply lines, destroying rolling stock on railways. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, and the Allied fighter bombers hunted them mercilessly. By October 13, Thunderbolt groups from the 9th Air Force were operating from forward airstrips in France and Belgium. They were flying multiple missions per day, ranging deep into Germany itself. The skies over Western Europe belonged to the Allies. The raw numbers tell the story. In June 1944, P-47 Thunderbolt, and de mensig Fatiensier Salve, and Bessinge Salve, and de Muthversalve, my Flakels Rischermels. My Flaker, with Mas Dash, my Flaker, Vesh, and 4, St 6 dort 6 story mine, and Chun my Flaker, and Chun mine Thale Suv, Dix Durenzier, my Flaker, my Flaker, my Flaker. My Flakels were, my Flaker, 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 Flaker, my 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 Flaker. The P-47 could absorb damage. Its radial engine had redundancy built in. If 3 cylinders were destroyed, the other 15 could keep it flying. The oil system had multiple passages. If one was punctured, others could maintain pressure. The pilot sat behind thick armor plate that could stop 20mm cannon shells. Lieutenant Colonel Van Slayden brought damaged P-47s home 5 separate times during his combat tour. On one mission, a flak round hit one of his propeller blades, tearing away a chunk of metal. The vibration made the entire aircraft shake. His visibility disappeared. He described it as looking like encrypted television. But he got home. On another mission over the Ruhr River Dam in Germany, a flak hit damaged his engine. Chaos ensued. He fought the controls, pushed levers, turned switches, and barely managed to land. On the ground inspecting the damage, he was surprised at how small the hole was compared to the effects it had caused. But Head made it home. In another aircraft he would have bailed out over Germany. This survivability had a multiplicative effect on Allied air power. A pilot who survived today could fly tomorrow. Experience accumulated. Tactics improved. The Thunderbolt squadrons became more effective with each passing month. The German flak crews, by contrast, suffered staggering casualties. Flak gunners were exposed, vulnerable to strafing fire, and couldn't retreat when attacked. When a P-47 rolled in with 8 50 caliber machine guns firing 3,000 rounds per minute, combined flak crews died. During the retreat from Normandy 3, Flakorts lost 11,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. That's more than half its strength. 2 of its 3 flak Sturm regiments were destroyed. The Wehrmacht attempted to replace these losses, but by late 1944, Germany was running out of men. The replacements were younger, less trained, and less effective. The ammunition supply was failing. Factories were being bombed, railways were being strafed, and what ammunition did reach the front often had defects from sabotage by slave laborers. By the winter of 1944-45, German flak effectiveness had declined significantly. The guns were still dangerous. Pilots still had to respect the threat, but they were no longer the devastating defensive weapon they'd been in early 1944. The Thunderbolt had won the duel. Colonel Leo Moon rolled his P-47 D-27 into a shallow dive, lining up the train for a rocket attack. It was March 12, 1945. The war was in its final weeks. The Third Reich was collapsing. But the fighting continued. Moon fired his 4 5-inch rockets into the locomotive. The rockets struck home, and the locomotive erupted in flame. 2 tank cars behind it exploded, spewing burning fuel. Moon pulled up and looked for another target. In the distance he saw a plume of smoke rising from what appeared to be a short tunnel, a second train. He swung around to attack. That's when he noticed something odd. Smoke rising from the middle of the train. Not steam from the locomotive. Gun smoke. Flak car, Moon muttered. The Germans had started mounting anti-aircraft guns on flat cars in the middle of trains. Usually 2-centimeter weapons, sometimes 3.7 centimeters. Mobile point defense that caught attacking pilots by surprise. Moon had already committed to the attack. At 300 mph, there was no time to break off. He rolled in, guns blazing, and opened fire on the train. The flak car opened fire back. Moon heard the distinctive sound of 20mm rounds hitting his aircraft. Like hail on a tin roof, Head later described it. His left wing lit up with sparkling impacts. Something vital shattered. He pulled up hard, climbing into the overcast, and checked his instruments. His brake was shot out. His pitot tube, the device that measured airspeed, was simply gone. Just a hole in his wing where it used to be. Moon made it back to base flying by feel, estimating his airspeed based on engine RPM and the sound of wind over the canopy. His ground crew counted 27 separate 20mm hits in the left wing. In any other aircraft, those hits would have been fatal. In the P-47, they were repairable. The aircraft was flying again within 3 days. Stories like moons were common by March 1945. The Thunderbolts ranged across Germany, attacking anything that moved. Trains were prime targets. Destroying a train meant hundreds of tons of supplies never reached the front. But trains were also among the most dangerous targets. The flak cars were experienced, well-positioned, and deadly. On March 7th, the U.S. 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine at Remagen, the first intact bridge across the Rhine seized by Allied forces. It was a strategic prize beyond measure. If the Allies could pour troops and armor across the Rhine, the road to Berlin was open. The Germans threw everything they had at that bridge, trying to destroy it. Artillery, airstrikes, even experimental weapons. One experimental weapon was the Henschel H-297 Phone, a 7.3-centimeter barrage flak rocket launcher, designed to throw up a wall of explosions that would shred attacking aircraft. The Germans tested it against Thunderbolts attacking near Remagen. It had no effect. The P-47s simply flew through the barrage, absorbed whatever hits they took, and continued their missions. By April 1945, the 8th, 9th, and 12th Air Forces began an all-out assault on remaining Luftwaffe airfields in Germany and Italy. The goal was simple: destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground so it couldn't interfere with the final Allied advance. On April 14th, Lieutenant Colonel Van Slayden led the 36th Fighter Group on a mission against multiple German airfields. They were hunting for aircraft to destroy, but they expected fierce resistance. "We caught them with their pants down," Slayden later wrote. The 36th struck airfield after airfield, strafing parked aircraft, bombing hangars, destroying fuel dumps. By the time they finished, the ground was covered in burning aircraft and equipment. The sky was full of smoke. German flak response was scattered and ineffective. Many positions didn't fire at all, either abandoned or out of ammunition. The few guns that did fire were quickly silenced by strafing runs. It was a slaughter. In the first 2 days after taking command of the 36th Fighter Group in January 1945, Slayden's pilots shot down 5 Luftwaffe aircraft, destroyed dozens on the ground, and demolished an airbase. His pilots strutted around like they'd won the war. Slayden concluded he had one hell of a group of fighter pilots. He was right. May 8, 1945. VE Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Lieutenant Colonel Van Slayden stood beside his P-47 Pete the Pup and tried to process what they'd accomplished. Head flown 142 combat missions. Head survived flak mechanical failures and the occasional Luftwaffe fighter. He was going home. Around him, ground crews were celebrating, but Slayden was thinking about numbers. From June 1944 through May 1945, the 8th and 9th Air Forces lost approximately 1,400 P-47 Thunderbolts in combat. Flak accounted for more than half those losses, over 700 aircraft. That sounds like a German victory, but those losses came from more than 1.8 million P-47 sorties flown during that same period. That's a loss rate of 0.778%, less than 1/10%. For every Thunderbolt shot down, approximately 1/300 sorties were flown successfully. The Germans, by contrast, lost 3. Flakhorse, nearly 1,000 guns destroyed, 11,000 men killed or captured. They lost hundreds of mobile flak vehicles. They expended millions of rounds of ammunition. They diverted 20% of their entire military budget to flak ammunition production in the final months of the war. And they still couldn't stop the Thunderbolts. The P-47 had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do: provide close air support to ground forces, while surviving in the most hostile environment imaginable. It had flown more sorties than any other American fighter. It had destroyed more ground targets than any other aircraft. It had supported the liberation of France, the defeat of Germany, and the end of the war in Europe. The Luftwaffe pilots and flak gunners had expected the American fighter bombers to be easy targets when they came low to attack. They'd been trained that fighter bombers were vulnerable, slow, predictable, exposed. They were wrong. The P-47 was vulnerable. It was armored, fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who'd refined their tactics through hard-won experience. Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer survived the war. His gun crew was one of the lucky ones. They'd suffered casualties, but the core of the unit remained intact. On VE Day, Klaus laid down his weapon and became a prisoner of war. Years later, he was asked about first, survivability matters. The P-47's rugged construction saved hundreds of pilots' lives. Aircraft that could absorb damage and still fly multiplied Allied air power because experienced pilots survived to fly again. The loss of the aircraft was acceptable. The loss of the trained pilot was not. Second, tactics evolve. Both sides adapted continuously. The P-47 pilots developed high-speed dive attacks, constant maneuvering, and mutual support. The German flak crews developed patience, camouflage, and mobile tactics. The side that adapted faster won. Third, combined arms are unstoppable. The P-47 didn't win alone. It was part of a system: ground forces calling in airstrikes, reconnaissance, identifying targets, logistics, keeping the aircraft flying. The Germans fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by a system that was greater than any individual component. Fourth, moral factors matter. By mid-1944, German flak crews knew they were losing. They knew the Allies ruled the skies. They knew their ammunition was defective, their replacements were untrained, and defeat was inevitable. They fought anyway, but the knowledge affected their performance. The Allied pilots, by contrast, knew they were winning. They knew they had the best aircraft, the best training, and the best support. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics and sustained operations that ground down German defenses. Sachs, his actions. But Sachs' oversaw its superiority is worth paying. The Allies lost 700 Thunderbolts to Flak in 11 months. That's a significant price. But those aircraft flew 1.8 million sorties that destroyed German logistics, isolated the battlefield, and supported ground operations. The ground forces advanced faster, suffered fewer casualties, and achieved decisive victory because the skies were clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered service in 1943 as an escort fighter. It struggled in that role. It couldn't match the range of the P-51 Mustang for deep penetration missions. But in the fighter-bomber role it was unmatched. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic Aviation built 15 686 Thunderbolts. It was the most produced American fighter of World War II. More Thunderbolts were built than Mustangs, Corsairs, or Hellcats. They served in every theater. They flew from carriers and land bases. They fought in the frozen skies over Germany and the sweltering jungles of the Pacific. They served with the USAAF, RAF, Soviet Air Force, and Free French Air Force. But their finest hour was over Normandy. On June 6, 1944, Luftwaffe pilots and flak gunners watched the massive invasion fleet offshore and prepared to face the American fighter bombers. They'd been trained. They'd been equipped. They were ready. They expected easy targets. Instead, they faced 8 tons of armor, firepower, and determination dropping from the sky at 400 miles per hour, armed with bombs, rockets, and 850 caliber machine guns that could saw a vehicle in half. The P-47 Thunderbolts ruled the skies over Normandy not because they were invulnerable. They weren't. Flak killed hundreds of pilots and destroyed hundreds of aircraft. They ruled the skies because they were survivable enough, fast enough, and powerful enough to press home their attacks, despite the flak absorb the damage and come back the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. And the day after that. Until Germany surrendered. Klaus Fischer was asked one final question during his interview. If you could go back and change one thing about defending against the P-47s, what would it be? He thought for a long moment. Better guns would have helped. better ammunition, more training, more aircraft of our own. He paused. But honestly, nothing would have changed the outcome. They had too many aircraft, too many pilots, too much industry. We were fighting a machine that couldn't be stopped. He looked directly at the interviewer. The Americans called it the Jug. The Juggernaut. That's what it was. You couldn't stop it. You could only survive it. He smiled sadly. Most of us didn't. Thumbers. Total P-47s, built 15, 686, 9th Air Force sorties, in June 1944. 29,000 P-47 groups, operating from France, by August 1944. 13. 3rd, Flak losses in Normandy. 1,000 guns, 11,000 men. P-47 losses on D-Day. 9 aircraft. P-47 loss rate in June 1944, 0.65. Total P-47 combat losses. June 1944, May 1945, 1,400 aircraft. Total P-47 sorties. June 1944, May 1945, 1,800,000. Overall loss rate, 0.078. The verdict: Luftwaffe pilots. Expected easy targets. German flak gunners, expected to stop the Allied fighter bombers with concentrated anti-aircraft fire. They were all wrong. The P-47 Thunderbolt ruled the skies over Normandy, and the German defenders learned the hard way what American pilots already knew. When 8 tons of American steel came screaming out of the sky at 400-mile-per-hour armor-plated and bristling with guns, the only smart thing to do was take cover and pray it wasn't coming for you. Because if it was, no amount of flak was going to stop it.